So I picked something up today that I've never tried before. It's called a Stay Wet palette. So let's see what this kit comes with. On the back it says it comes with 1 case, 2 hydro foams, and 100 pieces of hydro sheet. Oh, come on. Oh, that's hard to open. Mostly what I want this for is to extend my paint's open time. Now, I like to work with gouache and watercolor, and the reason that I like to work with those mediums is because I don't have to worry about the paint drying out on the palette. Gouache and watercolor are both paints that reactivate with water. So when you have dry paint and you add water to it, it will moisten the paint back up and you can use it again. So if I'm working with gouache and it happens to dry on the palette, I can just reactivate it with water and I don't have to worry about it. But with acrylic and with acrylic gouache, you can't do that. The paint won't reactivate. It is permanent once it's dried. And for me, that's a problem because I always feel like I'm in such a tight rush whenever I'm working with acrylic or acrylic gouache or other paints that dry out super quickly and can't be reactivated. So it comes with 100 of these sheets that go on top of the sponge, and then it comes with 2 hydro sponges. What you're supposed to do is lay this in here and then wet it, but just wet enough that the sponge remains damp. I like that it comes with 2 sponges too, so that once this one gets like all nasty and like can't be washed out anymore, you can replace it. And then you lay this over top, and once it's wet, you can put your paint on the palette sheet and it will absorb moisture from the sponge slow enough that it remains moist for longer and you can use it for longer. Okay, I don't know if it's possible to tell. The sponge is wet. And now we take our glorified parchment paper and we want to smooth out any bubbles. The paper is a little bit smaller than the sponge, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. I kind of wish either if the paper were a little bit larger or just the same size as the sponge. So let's grab a couple paints. I have this cadmium red acrylic, some acrylic gouache, and some soft body acrylic. I've also got this sheet of gray toned palette paper. So I'm gonna see how long the paint will stay wet on the Stay Wet palette as compared to this dry palette paper. And just for, you know, simulation's sake, paint going off to the side, and same over here. And out of curiosity. Okay. I was expecting a lot more transfer. Alright, I'm gonna come back to this in a couple minutes. I'd assume what you're intended to do is close this if you intend to step away for more than a few minutes, so I'm gonna do that. Okay, so it's only been a few minutes. However, I can literally already see there are some areas of the acrylic paint on the gray palette paper that have effectively already dried. Yeah, that's kind of just flaking off. But I can still see all of this paint is glistening. Like, all of this paint is still wet. Okay, it's been probably, I don't know, half an hour? These are still, I can tell, glisteningly wet. Like, yeah, that's possibly even more wet than it was, when it got laid down. It's just been absorbing water this whole time. Meanwhile, the gouache is totally dry. I don't know if it's possible to tell on camera, but both of the acrylic paints have kind of this film over top of them. Like they're wet in the middle, but they've got this film over top of them. I'm gonna leave this open while I go eat lunch. I'm kind of scared to do that, but I'm gonna do it anyway. And when we come back, we'll see if this has developed any kind of film over the top. Okay, so I have gone and eaten lunch and then ran a few errands. We're back now. It's clear that this paint is pretty dry. There is a solidly dry film on top of both of these acrylic paints. This is still completely wet. I think the gouache is still totally wet too. Even though that was the first one to dry on the dry palette. But yeah, these have stayed totally wet. I've been using this palette for a few weeks now, and I wanted to do a little bit of an update. I've actually had the paint that's in this palette in the palette for a week straight, and it's still usable. It's a little funky, but it's definitely still wet. I also accidentally left the palette open overnight at one point, and when I came back in the morning, the paint was still wet. So yeah, safe to say that this palette does its job pretty well. By the way, I'm on TikTok now, if you couldn't tell by the floating logo in this clip. I have no idea what I'm doing over there. Anyway, that's it for this little experiment. If you want to get one of these for yourself, I will link the one that I purchased down in the description below. Until next time, take care.